Okay, welcome back. Now on to part two of depression and bipolar disorder. I just finished up by going through the standard criteria you need to meet in order to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And now let's move forward with some thought questions and maybe some perspectives of individuals who have had depression. That kind of gets us into a mindset of what it's like to have depression. Um, so just to think about it, do you think that feeling depressed is the same as having depression, at least in the clinical sense? Um, and is feeling depressed the same thing as feeling sad? So these are good questions, and sometimes it might be hard for somebody to really distinguish depression or grief or sadness from each other. They may seem the same, but at least clinically and at least in some levels, we can make some distinctions between things like sadness and grief and depression. All right. So on a personal story, let's talk a little more about what depression might feel like. This was a reporter, I believe, from the Guardian magazine or newspaper, and I just thought their little paragraph was a nice summary of at least their flavor of depression. All right. So this reporter, Tim Lott, goes on to say, so how is this misleadingly named curse, and he's referring to depression, differ from recognizable grief? For a start, it can produce symptoms similar to Alzheimer's: forgetfulness, confusion, disorientation. Making even the smallest decision can be agonizing. It can affect not just the mind, but also the body. I start to stumble when I walk or become unable to walk in a straight line. I am more clumsy and accident prone. In depression, you become in your head two-dimensional, like a drawing rather than a living, breathing creature. You cannot conjure your actual personality, which you can remember only vaguely in a theoretical sense. You live in or close to a state of perpetual fear, although you are not sure what it is that you're afraid of. So yeah, I thought that lot there summarized a lot of what people report feeling under depression. And I think he had a lot of interesting statements there that you can't identify what it is you're afraid of or what you're depressed about. You have these symptoms that don't seem to make sense, like your physical body isn't working right. And all these can contribute to depression. All right, comparing depression and sadness. Sadness, you can think of it as just, it is a normal emotion. We all have it, every one of us. And it's usually as a reaction to some sort of environmental, situational condition. So a friend leaves us, somebody in our family passes away, we break up a relationship. All these situations can lead to sadness. It's usually, in this case, at least by definition, sadness, defined here at least, is caused by a specific identifiable kind of situation, and then fades away. But depression has something to do with sadness, but the problem is it doesn't fade away. It also has those factors that I talked about in the DSM-5, all these different factors, this loss of decision making and this kind of unidentifiable sense of kind of anxiety. You might have suicidal ideation. So there's a lot more to depression than just sadness. So you also, in depression, it really affects typically your ability to function in daily life and just get by on a given day. So it's also not about being sad about something in particular, but more about being hopeless about everything. You can't put your finger on it. So saying they're separate entirely, though, is not entirely true either. Sadness and stress itself, like if you have a very stressful event, or someone dear to you passes away, or something else happens, you lose your job, or something else terrible happens in your life, those events can trigger sadness, but they can also trigger depression as well. So sadness and the stress perhaps associated with the sadness and that event can lead to depression. And in a bit, I'll talk about the really strong connection between stress and depression. Related to that, and related to sadness and the contribution of an event to sadness and potentially down the line, if it lasts long enough, to depression, is the current situation we're all in, COVID-19. Of course, we're all right now dealing with the consequences of how that has completely disrupted our lives, our sense of our future, our jobs, our livelihood, our reliability of our income, perhaps. And so there's a lot of loss, I think, that a lot of us are feeling. Even routine. I mean, even feeling that you've lost your general routine that kind of organized and set your life forward, losing that can really feel like a loss. So I completely understand. I mean, I think I can speak for myself, but yes, I felt the very kind of disorienting sense as a result of COVID-19 and how it's disrupted my life. So I think things are kind of, let's say, coalescing into a routine again in my life, but it's definitely has been a disorienting and troubling experience. So dealing with that, if, for example, any of you are dealing with kind of the troubles and the stresses of both COVID-19 and the related uncertainties that it's causing, but also if you have other issues, any other issues with alcohol or drug use or other crises in your life, there is a lot of help at the university, and that help is available. It has not been shut down as a result of COVID-19. If you haven't heard of it, there's the CAPS program, Counseling and Psychiatric Services, and Campus Health. It's free to all students. They have a phone number. That's the number I have at the bottom of the slide. Just call it. It's open. There's also a medical after hours number as well. But yes, you can talk to a professional, somebody who's trained to discuss any type of condition that you might be really experiencing right now, from anxiety, body image disorders, alcohol abuse, just relationship issues, sexual assault, other things like that. So I highly recommend, if you're going through any trouble times like that, please reach out to CAPS. They're incredibly helpful. And they have started to focus on specifically the conditions being related to COVID-19 and the isolation that it can produce. So there's a little video, I put a link here. That's one of the people there at CAPS talking about how they're kind of dealing with or helping people through COVID-19. So definitely click on the link if you're interested in their in kind of their view and their services. And beyond that, for more ongoing treatment for other types of disorders, there's also another program. I don't know too much about it, but CAPS and Campus Health at least is connected with this. It's this Tau Pathways program. So it's another way you can connect with a therapist and get help. So also recommend checking that out. All right, there's some bobcats. All right, that's our front yard. All right. Okay, the last segment of this segment, I'm going to switch gears a bit, is going into the genetic origins and genetic associations with depression. So is depression a genetic disorder? I might have mentioned before that, for example, alcoholism has a very strong genetic component. As we'll learn in the next segment of lecture, schizophrenia has a very strong genetic component. Do your genes determine whether or not you will get depression? Well, in some sense, it can. So like many of these genetic studies, they boil down to looking at twins. So you look at two people, especially like a monozygotic twin, which means you guys really share pretty much not only the DNA, but also the same kind of natal environment as you're developing. And if one monozygotic identical twin gets a mood disorder, like major depressive disorder, the likelihood of the other twin having it at some point in their life is 65%. So that's pretty darn high. So there is a genetic component if you happen to get the genes of somebody who has major depressive disorder. It goes down if it's a fraternal twin, so you didn't share the same kind of cellular environment. Their rate goes down because they share less of the DNA too. There is genetic concordance of bipolar. Okay, so I didn't talk much about bipolar, but I did say a little bit that it is having depression, but it's also cycling between depression and these manic episodes. So there's an even stronger connection between your genes in bipolar disorder than depression. It's up to 80% instead of 65%. But this is not to say that genes are the only story in either of these disorders. Most individuals with depression do not have a clear genetic link. And if you're unlucky enough to be in a family that has a long history of depression, yes, your risk is much higher. But the general population, individuals with depression do not generally have a clear genetic connection or source of that depression. And there is no single known depression gene. But what can happen is that the genes, if you have some genes that may predispose you to depression, they might make you more vulnerable to, let's say, whether some sort of environmental event or stress triggers a depressive episode. Okay, moving to stress and these environmental situations that might put you into, potentially down the line, into a depressive state. Let's talk about stress. As I mentioned before, stress induced by some sort of immediate event, maybe COVID-19 or the loss of a friend, that's usually associated with more kind of a non-clinical state of sadness. But if it persists for a very long time, that can transition to depression. So what are the environmental factors that can trigger depression? Usually it's pretty much anything that can cause persistent stress and anxiety. So as we learned way back in the kind of HPA axis lectures and the sympathetic nervous system and stress responses, we learned all about these things like corticotropin releasing factor, ACTH, and glucocorticoids, cortisol, and how they regulate the stress response, the fight or flight response. But if that fight or flight response stays high for a long time, it can cause problems and lead to more problems. But what happens is if you look at depressed patients, you see that these CRF levels, the ACTH levels, the glucocorticoid levels, like cortisol, are elevated. That's one of the most consistent things seen in people with depression. And so if you look at the little image or the plot on the right, it plots on the y-axis plasma cortisol levels with depressed patients, some sort of control, some other psychiatric control, probably some other psychiatric patients with another condition, and then normal controls. And you just see this incredible difference with the depressed patients, where many of them have plasma cortisol levels that are 3 times higher than psychiatric controls. So it's even more than that, actually, that there's a break in the y-axis. It goes all the way almost up to 30. And so you see it's like 8 times higher, 9 times higher than even the highest levels in the psychiatric controls for those really extreme patients. So stress levels can truly increase the CRF, ACTH, glucocorticoids, but depression itself is associated with those levels being chronically elevated. That's an issue, though, because as we've learned before, we have this feedback, this negative feedback loop that controls our stress response. It might start with our hippocampus, which triggers perhaps release of CRF from the hypothalamus, which then can basically trigger our pituitary gland to release ACTH, which then triggers the adrenal gland, which again rests on top of your kidney, to trigger glucocorticoid release. One of the most common ones that we talk about is cortisol, which then feeds back into the brain, into regions like the hippocampus, which can tell it to shut up. Essentially, it's this negative feedback loop that then stops the stress response from continuing. Now, the problem in depression is that, as we just learned, it's going haywire all the time. And persistent activation of this loop all the time, where the cortisol is flooding the hippocampus and the hypothalamus all the time, really does a number on both the neurons and the receptors there that makes them less sensitive and less able to inhibit the loop. As a result, the negative feedback no longer works as well, which then feeds into itself so that even more glucocorticoids are released into the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. And the problem with that is that glucocorticoids themselves, like cortisol, if you dump cortisol in your hippocampus, it can kill or damage your neurons. And so it's actually causing physical damage to your hippocampus. And so that's one of the serious problems of persistent stress and how it can lead to a longer lasting, potentially depressive state. Now, on the good side of things, though, antidepressant drugs like SRIs, with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and MAOIs, you've actually heard about those too. Monoamine oxidase is you've heard about that, but inhibitors, those things that inhibit that, those are two antidepressant treatments, but they prevent the CRF from increasing. And so they might work by short-circuiting that axis. And then new drugs that are being developed are trying to really work on short-circuiting that perpetual stress response produced by overactivation of the HPA axis. Okay, stress and major depressive disorder in the hippocampus. So I already talked a little bit about the hippocampus, but it is really an important region to consider with stress. We've talked about how it's important for our ability to form memories, but it's also, again, a super important area that stops this persistent stress response. And there's hippocampal damage in people who have depression. All right, so this high levels of stress hormone, cortisol, can cause damage. Well, what's the damage? So there are reduced dendritic branches and spines after stress in the hippocampus. There's fewer neurons that are generated in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is special among brain regions in that it actually has a small region within itself that can generate and make new neurons. But that stops in depression and in stress. And you get just neurons dying in general. Not only are the synapses getting smaller and the dendrites getting smaller, but the neurons just plain old die. And it looks like many antidepressant drugs act to reverse all of those processes, at least in animal models of depression, that all those processes can be turned around with antidepressants. Okay, with that, I will end with end part 2. All right, that's Roadrunner, by the way, who did get lunch. So the Roadrunner's probably pretty happy. All right, so I'll stop there.